as the lead scientist behind the Metro Vancouver mapping project, my goals are to help provide education and training about what the project's been about and what maps are coming. And it really is quite technical. And so I am grateful for everybody's attempt to try to learn something today about that. But I'm here to learn too. I am a scientist and I'm putting these maps out there in the world, and I'm understanding the challenges and hindrances to using them. And I'm interested to find out how I can help more as we progress to understanding them together. Thanks.
Thanks, Sherry. And I'll just ask Jessica Sherbridge to say a few keynotes before we get started.
Thanks, Tamsin. Yeah, I just wanted to provide a few quick comments on the high level why before we jump into the details, what the opportunity is here. I'm sure as many of you attending today know, seismic risk is catastrophic in the lower mainland and southwest BC, and there's also much we can do about it. The traditional framing around this is death, dollars, and downtime. In terms of financial loss, some of the numbers are $20 billion in direct damages from shaking. That doesn't integrate consideration for aftershocks. An additional $10 billion from fire following, as just two examples among many, many studies on this. Loss of life and casualties, unlike other major hazards of concern, such as flood and fire in British Columbia, seismic still represents a significant threat to life, most often as a result of building failures or ineffective evacuation from tsunami. Recovery, some say Christchurch took 10 years to recover. Others suggest it will take 50 to 100 years for them to fully recover. Our cities and communities in Southwest BC will be forever changed by a major seismic event. The mapping you're hearing about today is a big step in the right direction for improving our disaster risk management practices. So thank you all for being here. And I'll pass it back to Tamsin.
Thanks, Jessica. I'll just go over the agenda briefly. And with that, I also want to say that I am not a seismic expert, and I am learning with my whole brain how to describe these seismic concepts. And so we're lucky today to have Dr. Molnar here. I will give a layman's version of description, and Sherry can jump in with more technical where I've erred. Okay. So we're going to have an introduction to the project and then to the seismic hazards and the associated maps, stop for a question and answer, and then move on to potential uses for the maps in planning, dig a bit deeper into that, and then wrap up. So we're going to start this morning with a Slido poll. So the way to access this is to use your phone with the QR code or go to a browser tab at slido.com. You'll see right at the top a place to put this number, 1054652. So if you could go there, I'll give you a moment. We want to know what kind of planners are in the room. There's also a place here to put, to put whether you are an engineer or an emergency manager. Great, so we've got a really good mix. Some folks that do none of the above. Whoops, sorry, that's my fault. I keep doing that. Excellent. Well, these keep changing, but it looks like we have current development planners, long-range planners, resilience planners, emergency managers, engineers, and lots of folks that do none of these things. So that's interesting. I'm going to go to the next Slido. So you should see the Slido question shift for you. So we're looking at which hazards do you consider most in your work? We just want to get a sense. Unfortunately, I can't scroll down, which is an error on my part, but there is a place there for seismic hazard, flooding, all of the above. I'm sure many of you look at all these hazards. Look at that, that's amazing. So lots of folks working on many different hazards, lots of seismic hazard, which is great. Okay, thank you for answering that. You can stop looking at the Slido for now. We'll come back to it later in the webinar, just with the fantastic attendance. It's a good tool. Okay, some important concepts. And these are important because you're gonna hear reference to these concepts throughout the webinar. So susceptibility on the left. This is given ground conditions. Where would these hazards that we're gonna speak about be more likely in the region? But given the variety of seismic events possible, we need to choose specific magnitudes to help us understand the hazard intensity across the region. So to do that, we use concepts like return period and exceedance probability. And I'm sure many of you looking at the hazards you're involved in are familiar with a 1 in 200 or a 1 in 500 year flood event. So we use those. In the seismic concept for these maps, we're using 2 return periods, one that's 475 year return period and one that's 2,475 year return period. So that's the magnitude of earthquake that could be expected in the location at an average of either 475 years or 2,475 years. So a bit of a more rare event and a less rare event. And those coincide with exceedance probabilities. So the probability that that given magnitude will be exceeded in a 50-year time period. So the 475 return period coincides with a 10% probability in 50 years, and the 2,475 year return period with a 2% probability. So that just helps us understand a hazard threat for those different earthquake magnitudes. And then risk. Risk we can only really assess when we introduce information about what is getting shaken in an earthquake. So the building and infrastructure types and the associated damage that could result. So it helps us better understand consequences. Sherry, anything to add in my attempt at description of these concepts?
Not really, just that seismic is a different beast than other hazards. We don't really have an earthquake season, so our return periods are generally quite long. Like we deal with a mean return period of about 475 years, but for the building code, it's 2475. So quite different than the other hazards. Yeah.
Thanks, excellent. Okay, now I'm going to pass the mic to Sherry to introduce the project.
Thanks, Tamsin. So the project has this long name, Seismic Microzonation Mapping Project. We call it MVSMMP for fun. I know you're all used to acronyms. I'm a researcher at Western University, and so that's where the research takes place. We collaborate with the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, which is an institute affiliated with Western. And our funder or client is the BC Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness. We started the project in 2017, and at that time we were only tasked with really producing seismic microzonation maps or seismic hazard maps that look at earthquake shaking, liquefaction, and landslide for the western side of Metro Vancouver, almost up to Burnaby and Delta. And we've taken a phased approach to continually adding communities to the east as the project has progressed. So we've included up to Coquitlam and Surrey in 2018 into 2019. And now the project has been extended into 2026 to include all the way over into Maple Ridge and Langley. We are producing phase 1 maps that we call them, that include the area indicated on the map there for summer of 2024. We hope to make these freely available online by late June, early July. And then we're going to do some more field work, be out in Metro Vancouver again to finish up the phase 2 mapping into 2026. The difference in a seismic microzonation map from a seismic hazard map from the building code or from a federal government or the national seismic hazard map is that we're including local site conditions or ground conditions and how they will alter earthquake shaking. So yeah, maybe at this point you're starting to wonder or want to know what seismic microzonation maps are. And they're generally produced for cities or regions because that's the scale that you can deal with, including local site conditions. Our national seismic hazard map pretty much pretends that the whole country is the same dense soil condition. And then you can adjust the motions up or down given whether or not you're on relatively stiff or soft ground. But for us and for a region, for a city, we're much more interested in how local site conditions will change earthquake ground shaking. And so typical seismic hazards that are produced in terms of seismic microzonation maps are shaking, amplification or de-amplification, or the shaking level itself, or often in terms of liquefaction or landslide, or basically ground displacements that can happen from the shaking. So we need to know about the subsurface ground in terms of its geology, what kind of material it is. We have to know about its properties in terms of geophysical measurements. We have to know how that ground will also dynamically behave during an earthquake. So some kind of geotechnical laboratory, cyclic shear testing of soil information. So we call this all geodata, being geology, geophysics, and geotechnical information. Now I'm going to transition into trying to explain to you why seismic microzonation mapping hasn't really been done for Metro Vancouver to date. It's not that it hasn't been done. There are level 1 or level 2 levels of maps, and we'll get into that a little bit. There's been attempts, but not to a very high level or very comprehensive, systematic, consistent way for the whole region. And also, Metro Vancouver has a lot of complexities in comparison to other places in Canada. Number one is the seismic hazard itself, or where earthquakes occur. We live in an active tectonic setting. There's a subduction environment. An oceanic plate is subducting beneath the North American plate. And you can have earthquakes that occur in either of these two plates, shallow or deep. But also the one that the media talks about the most is whether or not we'll have a big one or a mega thrust earthquake on this fault between the two plates that goes from northern BC, northern California, all the way to southern BC. So if that whole thing ruptured at once up to maybe a magnitude 9, that's the big one. But that tectonic setting creates shallow earthquakes as well as deep earthquakes in the subducting plate. And that's very different. Let's contrast this to Eastern Canada, say Montreal or Ottawa. They only have to deal with the shallow earthquakes or seismic type 2, whereas Metro Vancouver has to deal with these 3 types of sources. Added to that, Tamsin, is the next slide in terms of the regional site conditions. It's a very busy slide, but I'm doing my best to convey to you that on the top, in these first 2 graphics, we have very old Jurassic Mesozoic rocks on Vancouver Island and the North Shore of Metro Vancouver. And around the late Cretaceous, there was a sedimentary basin that separated these 2 rock masses. And it still exists to this day. That's why there's water in between Vancouver and Vancouver Island. If you took the water away, we'd be walking down and through the Georgia Basin between these 2 rock masses. In the late Cretaceous, the Georgia Basin was full of sediments. You know, dinosaurs were roaming around, nice sedimentary material, but now today it's sedimentary rock. That is what's underneath Vancouver. You can see sandstone cliffs in Stanley Park. But as we keep moving south, after the last glaciation, after the last time the glaciers were around in Metro Vancouver, the Fraser River has been dumping sediment offshore of Vancouver and building up the Fraser River Delta only in the last 13,000 years. And so that's a nice thick package of silts and sands that are saturated and relatively soft. And that's a basin that sits inside of the sedimentary basin. And so it took me 3 minutes to explain this maybe, but this is something that's not normal in terms of geology. Metro Vancouver has all of this to deal with. And to contrast to Montreal or Quebec, sediments in Montreal are about 30 meters thick, but the Fraser River Delta is almost 300 meters thick, sitting on top of glaciated sediments that are up to maybe 500 meters deep. So the depth to rock under the Fraser River Delta could be a kilometer of sediments. And that's not something we normally deal with in seismic hazard.
Sherry, why do we need to worry about the basin? What does the basin do to seismic waves?
So on the one hand, it's rock, and we try to tell people that rock is very stiff and that you shouldn't anticipate strong shaking when you're on rock or very stiff material. But everything is relative. So sedimentary rock is softer than really hard rock on the North Shore. So you're going to see amplification in the sedimentary rock compared to the North Shore to begin with. But the Georgia Basin is about 6 kilometers deep by several kilometers wide. And so they're going to create long period shaking, or they're going to trap surface waves, generate surface waves and trap them. So they're going to reverberate inside of this basin. Or one last attempt is that the seismic energy doesn't get released or dissipate away. It's contained underneath Metro Vancouver and feeds back into the system, basically.
Thanks, Sherry. So my takeaway is it's complex. It's not straightforward. Okay, I'm going to your next slide.
Okay. This is a semi-important piece that I would like that the audience would take away from today, is that certainly anyone can make a map. You could be a geography student and needed to do an assignment, and you could come up with what the liquefaction or landslide susceptibility for the region would be if you just looked at a geology map and just looked at a topography map. Totally doable. That would what we would consider a level 1 assessment of seismic microzonation. You pull things that are available online, and you make some proxies of, okay, it's deep, it's soft, it's saturated, and come up with what the relative hazard would be. But what we've been trying to do for 7 years of the project is to push to have more and more geodata, more and more local measurements, to push to get to a high level of mapping, as well as including seismic hazard in terms of analyses as well. So it's the data is getting better, but then sophistication of the analyses is also being pushed to get to a high level of seismic microzonation maps for the entire region, systematically and consistently for the whole region. And the last point, maybe the next slide would help, is that, no, I lie, sorry, go back, Tamsin, is that level 3 maps are kind of rare in Canada. We often have pushed to level 2, and then we just kind of stopped there. And so this is what's new to deal with for end users, is that we've actually produced maps that are conveying how much hazard there is in terms of shaking, liquefaction, or landslide. We're not leaving it that you need to make a next analysis step. We've done the full analysis.
Best information available. Now,
Right.
I'll go to your next slide.
It reminds me to try to say it this way. The BC provincial government has funded to make it equitable for any region or local government or local community that they have access to the same understanding of seismic hazard in the region. And so that's what's new. That's maybe the biggest message to try to convey. What's so new and exciting about the project, or where we've come to, is that up till now, there's been no Canadian standard for producing seismic microzonation maps. They exist for most of the high-risk seismic cities in Canada. Montreal, Ottawa, Victoria, they all have seismic microzonation maps. But they were all probably made to level 2, not level 3. And they were all made between 1995 to 2010. And they're not based on the most up-to-date measures like the maps we've just been producing. Another issue has been that all of the seismic microzonation mapping that's been produced in Canada to date has always been just like a map, like a PDF file. And who can deal with that? Right now, in today's world, you want a digital layer. You want to lay the data on top of what you want to analyze. And so that's what's new, is that we're making these maps available as data products. You can download the map as a PDF, but you can also download the GIS file of the map as well. And I think that's been the biggest hindrance to use of seismic microzonation mapping in Canada to date. But I'm also starting to realize how technical and complex this is, and I might be surprised that that's maybe the biggest challenge, is people don't know what they are or how to use them. Last but not least, I think I've tried to say is that we don't have a lot of level 3 maps, or that the product isn't as sophisticated as it could be, or the final answer that it could be. And we've gone as far as we can to produce seismic microzonation maps for Metro Vancouver. So the last things I would try to say on the bottom right is that there are a lot of maps coming, up to 30. Some of them are just this level 2 or susceptibility level that are perfect inputs for doing your own hazard analysis or your own risk analysis. But the province wanted us to make it an equitable playing ground of making sure that the seismic hazard has been done in a consistent way for the whole region. So there are 18 seismic hazard maps coming as well. But that the maps are simply an expression of 7 years of work. So we also have a geodatabase, we also have velocity models, and all of this in the long run is hoped to be made available and be accessible for future seismic hazard or improvements to seismic microzonation mapping in the region in future.
Thanks, Sherry. And just to confirm, the maps that we're going to see in this presentation are still being finalized.
That's right.
So these are draft maps, and they'll be finalized by about when?
They're being finalized now. They'll be freely available for everyone, hopefully at the end of June.
Thank you, Sherry. Okay, on to the exciting part where I tried to introduce seismic hazard. So now we're going to move into hazards and maps. One thing I forgot to mention is there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we encourage you to put your questions there. I see there's a few in the chat, and that's fine. We'll make sure those are included as well. So thank you for putting those there, and we'll stop for Q&A after this section. Okay, so when we talk about seismic hazards, there's the primary seismic hazard of ground shaking, and then there's a multitude of secondary seismic hazards, such as tsunamis, fire following earthquake, surface fault ruptures. But as Sherry explained, the microzonation maps address 3 of the major secondary hazards. So they deal with shaking, amplification, and de-amplification. We'll get into what that is. And then seismic-induced liquefaction hazard and seismic-induced landslide hazard. So this next section is going to speak to each of these hazards, as well as show some susceptibility and hazard mapping. So let's start with the shaking, amplification, de-amplification. So when an earthquake occurs, seismic waves travel through the Earth's crust. And if these waves encounter certain types of soil, such as loose sediment and soft clay, they can slow down and become amplified. And this amplification can increase the intensity of the shaking experienced. And so that's why we care about amplification, because it can increase the intensity of the shaking. So even if you were in a location far away from the source, but in an area of high amplification hazard, you could still experience strong shaking and damage. So some important concepts for this section are shear wave velocity, and VS30, or shear wave velocity in the top 30 meters of the soil, is used in the building code. And this is really a property of soil related to density, and it looks at the velocity of the seismic waves as they move through the ground. So if it's very dense soil, they can move quite quickly and we don't get a lot of amplification. If it's softer soils, as we discussed, then we can get a lot of amplification, which accelerates the ground at the site and intensifies the shaking. The other concept that will come up is site period, and this is related more to time, and it's the natural frequency at which the ground oscillates or vibrates. So on those long periods, that's where it's more of a rocking or swaying motion, like being on a boat. And that can occur in deep or soft ground. And then the short period is is a higher frequency vibration or rattle. And that can occur more in stiff or shallow ground. And you'll see there's maps for different periods because amplification can and de-amplification can occur at different periods given the soils. Sherry, anything to add there?
I think that's pretty good. I think it's Tamsin's doing her best to give you guys a couple of definitions before I keep using these words over and over. So we'll talk about these for sure. Shear wave velocity, how stiff the ground is it soft or stiff? And site period is a mixture of soil thickness and its softness. So a long period site would be deep and or soft, to help define that a little bit more.
Thank you. Very helpful. Okay. So this is just an example of the amplification of ground shaking. So it's from observed effects of the 1985 Mexico City earthquake. So I'm going to focus on the graph in the upper left corner here to start. So you can see that top line is small but jagged, and that's the amplification or acceleration on the rock, or whereas you can see on that lower line the amplification you're getting relatively, and that's in the soft clay. And so shaking amplitude was 5 times higher on the soft clay, and there's a lot of damage done, collapse of 412 mid-height buildings. And so the amplification hazard really helps us understand where we need to mitigate the effects of amplified shaking, as well as where we might want to avoid locations for critical infrastructure. Sherry, there's a lot more on this slide. What else would you tell us?
Historically, we've known that soft soils can be dangerous in earthquakes, but it was this earthquake in 1985 that hammered home a few things that we're trying to tell you. One, the earthquake was so far away, you wouldn't have thought this should happen. It was 400 kilometers away. Given the magnitude and the distance, the shaking shouldn't have been that high. But Mexico City is an old lake that was drained and built on. So you built on top of something that was soft. That was the first error, potentially. But you also built different heights of buildings on different thicknesses of soils. And this experience demonstrated where the resonance or site period or the vibration of the ground matches the vibration in the building above, you get damage. So that's what we're trying to show you in the picture above is, not all the buildings fell down, only the buildings where you had maybe this double resonance or you had this coupling between what you're building and what the ground was going to do in the earthquake. And so that's really where we learned to try to do this in the future. Last but not least is Mexico City is kind of this combination between just propagating motions one-dimensionally through something soft, but also this concept of you're in a basin, which are two kind of things together that have an effect here.
Thanks, Sherry. One additional question. So when you talk about sort of the period and the height of the building, am I correct in that taller buildings on longer periods is more face more damage and shorter buildings on short periods?
I wish so. On the internet, you can see if you had spaghetti noodles and you tried to resonate you could tap into a frequency of any particular length of a system. That really tall buildings on short or thin ground won't feel the shaking the same way, or you're not feeding in the energy to that system. And conversely, if you have something short on top of deep, thick ground, the energy that's coming in, the little short building just rides on top of it. It's they don't see each other is one way to say it as layman's as possible. But if the soil and the building are practically the same resonance, they're basically the same system, and they'll both respond together.
Okay. So my take home as a planner is that different ground conditions and shaking hazard or shaking susceptibility can affect a building differently depending on whether you're looking at a shorter, smaller walk-up or a very high building.
As a scientist, this is my hope, that the maps are used to understand what I should be building and where.
Thank you. Okay. Okay. Potential impacts from ground shaking amplification. Here's a picture from Christchurch. Really, I think we're familiar with these. You can see all sorts of damage to buildings and infrastructure and critical lifelines, underground utilities, cracks in foundations, twisting and swaying of buildings, as well as building collapse. Now I'm going to pass to Sherry to introduce the maps.
Thanks, Samson. So some text on this slide is trying to tell you the common types of measures that are used to make ground shaking or amplification hazard maps. Around the world, the most common measure is VS30, or this, it's one number that tries to summarize how soft the ground is in the top 30 meters. And 30 meters is very arbitrary. It was decided by people in California, and that's how deep they could drill in a day. So that seemed like a good idea. But in Metro Vancouver, we deal with sediments that are maybe up to 300 meters thick, or 10 times thicker. And so VS30 maybe isn't an appropriate measure to try to produce amplification hazard maps for Metro Vancouver. In order to understand shaking susceptibility, I think we've done an okay job trying to explain to you that it has to do with how thick the soil is, how soft the soil is. So it have a low shear wave velocity, and that those two impact the site period, or what period the ground is going to pass energy through. A thick, long period site will dampen or remove shorter periods. They won't even make it to the surface. But it's perfect. It preferentially filters for those long periods because it's nice and thick and soft and deep. That's what we would want to know in order to take it to the next step, to try to produce what the ground motion intensity or what the ground acceleration would be at the surface, and therefore try to map it in terms of an amplification or de-amplification, which is just a factor number. Is it greater than 1 or less than 1? Meaning, is it more intense or less intense shaking compared to a chosen reference condition? For our mapping, we choose to map relative to a VS of 760 meters per second, a relatively dense, stiff ground. All of that is very textual. So here's a graphic that hopefully tries to convey to you that at level 1 or 2, we're trying to understand the subsurface ground conditions in terms of the material properties, how thick it is, how soft it is. And we've produced maps for use in future that try to convey this, but they're just level 2. They just tell us if the ground would respond at short periods or long periods, how stiff it is or how soft it is. We want to take it to that level 3. We want to know how much will the ground amplify the shaking given the input earthquake intensities that we know of for the regional seismic hazard. Given all the earthquakes that can occur in a mean return period of 475 years, what will be the amplification or increase in the ground shaking intensity? That's a level 3. Maybe the next slide there, Tamsin. This is a fun graphic, I hope. You're going to watch how we've produced an amplification hazard map on the right-hand side. So these are different maps for different periods. They're conveying how much stronger the shaking intensity will be in warm colors, orange and red, compared to this reference ground condition of about 760 meters per second. You'll notice Surrey is mostly yellow. So Surrey is probably 600 meters per second. So it's probably close to this reference ground condition. And then you notice the map is going at different spectral periods. So 0.2 seconds and 0.5 seconds are shorter periods, thinner, stiffer ground. Longer periods of 2 and 5 seconds are also shown. What's maybe helpful to talk through is looking at the North Shore or at the north end of the map. At short periods, you see that it's kind of warm or orange, and that tells us that the soils are relatively soft but also thin. In contrast to the Fraser River Delta, which is very deep and thick, we see amplification at those longer periods, 2 or 5 seconds. But you'll also notice that in both cases, for the North Shore at long periods, and for the Fraser Delta at short periods, we get de-amplification, or that the intensity of shaking isn't that great compared to that dense soil. So it's a catch-22 in a way. Maybe that's not there are benefits that the intensity of shaking won't be as high, but then there's also the consequence that the ground will filter or amplify that motion at a particular period related to its properties. Last thing to try to convey to you is on the top left, we've run this analysis or this assessment for over 50 sites, considering 66 input time histories for these 50 sites, running it for 3 analyses. We have over 10,000 analyses to understand or predict these values. And then we also use our understanding of that shaking susceptibility across the region in the bottom left to map that out or understand it regionally.
Thanks, Sherry. Just a heads up to you, Sherry, that we need to move a little bit more quickly.
Right? This is a quick slide trying to say that you'll only see the maps, the 2 maps at the top. That's all we're giving you. But I'm trying to convey that it's both what's happening as the waves propagate through that soil right underneath the site, but also the fact that you might be in the sedimentary basin, which will affect the long periods. So both of them are in combination for our long period maps.
Thanks. Okay, shifting hazards. So we talked about shaking amplification, and now we're looking at liquefaction. So what is it? Liquefaction occurs when soil particles lose contact and the soil can end up behaving like a liquid, and you get such things as sand boiling, where you're getting a lot of sand coming up to the surface, lateral spreading, and ground settlement, ground cracking, all sorts of things that can cause damage to buildings and infrastructure. So here's another example, another picture from Christchurch with underground utility really impacted by liquefaction. So we can get foundation failure, sinking, buildings settling and tilting, all really creating damage. So I'm going to do the susceptibility map this time. So here's our liquefaction susceptibility map. So these are maps of the natural ground conditions. And we've known for a long time that the saturated sands in the Fraser River Delta are susceptible to liquefaction. I think it's really interesting to think about our regional infrastructure and our regional hazard and thinking about how our water, sewer, all infrastructure sort of crosses some of these areas in the region. And now Sherry will look at liquefaction hazard. So before I finish this map, the lighter colors are lower susceptibility, and of course those more intense orange and browns that you see in the delta, as well as the False Creek Flats and along the Fraser, are higher susceptibility. Sherry, the hazard.
Again, trying to hammer home this idea that on the left, this is where ground is sandy or saturated, so it would be susceptible to liquefaction. But will it really liquefy, given what we understand about how strong the shaking will be in a mean return period of 475 or 2475 years? So taking it up to that assessment of hazard, the liquefaction potential hazard. So we calculate the liquefaction potential index, LPI, as a value between 0 and greater than 35 at locations where we have geodata. And we see that LPIs are highest in the Fraser River Delta, as expected. But what's interesting to me is that even for 475 return period, for a relatively low input hazard of shaking, we will see significant liquefaction in the Fraser River Delta. We don't know exactly how to translate these LPI values unless we look at empirical correlations elsewhere in the world. So an LPI of 15 has been observed to be correlated with the presence of sand boils or ground cracking at the surface. Why we get such very high values is because we calculate this LPI over 20 meters, and either the liquefaction is so thick or it's so shallow that it makes its way to the surface, leading to this high hazard. You can see in eastern Richmond, or the northeastern part of the Fraser River Delta, there's relatively thick peat, and liquefaction might be happening below that, but we don't anticipate that it'll make its way to surface as much as it would elsewhere in the Fraser River Delta. So that's what this map is kind of saying. And then if you toggle it, Tamsin, with the 2475-year return period, basically the intensity of the input motions has gone up by 2 times. And so obviously the liquefaction hazard gets higher. So a big take-home message is every single hazard map is always more hazardous for a longer return period. But what I've learned from doing this project is that we do have to be concerned about liquefaction in the Fraser River Delta, even at the 475-year return period.
Thanks, Sherry. I like the toggle.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, on to our third hazard. So this is seismic induced landslides. I think we're all familiar with landslides. What I think is interesting is that susceptibility to rainfall induced landslides, which we know is increasing with climate change, can also be interpreted from these landslide susceptibility maps. Potential impacts from landslides, obviously direct impacts to buildings and infrastructure, as well as those utility disruptions and environmental impacts. Here's the susceptibility map. So this is qualitative susceptibility categories based on slope angle, geology, and slope conditions refined through 2D slope stability analysis. So unsurprisingly, we see some of those steep creeks on the North Shore. You can see the Jericho UBC cliff area, some areas in Coquitlam where there's a higher susceptibility. I'm going to pass it to Sherry for landslide hazard now.
Right. As Tamsin said, our landslide susceptibility tries to push to level 2, where we've tried to understand the material properties and the slope geometry more than just downloading a DEM and just looking at a geology map. And so we understand what critical acceleration the slope might begin to fail, which was the previous map. But so that's whether it's susceptible. But now let's input what that 475-year input motion would be, given the regional seismic hazard. And what's interesting now for me is that not a lot of slopes are supposed to fail for this lower intensity of shaking. But if you toggle it, Tamsin, with the other map at the 2475, yeah, the hazard always goes up for this longer return period. But what I've learned is that the slopes in the Metro Vancouver region are typically into older Pleistocene age or older sediments that are relatively stiff in comparison and don't begin to fail from seismic hazard until we get to these relatively high, rare intensities of motions. That's not to say there weren't high hazard areas for the 475-year return period. But here's a good example of, you know, asking whether or not there's going to be landslides given that hazard. And it's not necessarily, the answer isn't always yes.
Thanks, Sherry. Okay, we have arrived at our question and answer period, a few minutes later than we thought, but we would like to address some of your questions. Our colleague Jessica will unmute and let us know what the questions are. And the next section of the presentation will deal with land use planning and these hazards, so we can address those specific questions a bit later.
Thanks, Tamsin. Micah, I think, wins the award for the first question. He's asking, so level 3 maps do capture ground shaking intensity itself as well as liquefaction, etc. Correct? Question mark. Sherry, did you want to take that one?
We try to differentiate that level 2 is just our assessment of the ground. And it could be triggered by anything. So a landslide susceptibility map could be triggered by rainfall, or it could be triggered by an earthquake, but we're saying it's susceptible. The hazard level 3 map is considering that input motion. We're putting in what we understand in terms of how strong the shaking will be given this mean return period, in combination with that level 2 understanding of the subsurface conditions. Yes.
Does that make sense, Micah?
Yes and no. So it does. So the ground motion, the ground shaking, then it's a factor in describing the liquefaction or whatever that particular secondary hazard, but the map itself is not conveying liquefaction and also some account of like the shake intensity at the location. So it would be appropriate to use the map to understand the hazard related to the liquefaction or landslide or whatever, but not necessarily to understand like how much the ground will shake as well, right?
The amplification map would try to convey the intensity of the shaking that would be increased or decreased relative to dense ground. So that's telling you the degree of the shaking. But the two liquefaction hazard maps are saying this is the degree to which we anticipate liquefaction effects given the 2 different intensities of shaking. You should be always looking at the 2 return period type maps and contrasting, comparing them, because they do consider this just change in the input intensity of the shaking.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks for the question, Micah. Tanya is asking, is the 2017 seismic vulnerability assessment for Victoria considered a level 2 or level 3? This reminds me of the slide we used to have on this, Sherry, in a previous presentation.
I would say, so a seismic vulnerability assessment would be a risk assessment, not a hazard assessment. And I don't know if it probably considered Victoria microzonation mapping, which we would call a sophisticated level 2 analysis, or it would have been the susceptibility to shaking in those maps.
So room for improvement based on these new methodologies that we're seeing is my understanding. And then Don Kennedy's asking, Sherry, sorry if you covered and I missed this. Do you or does BC intend these are used for regional network level projects or for local projects at specific sites?
It has been an interesting learning experience working with EGBC on the uses of seismic microzonation maps guidelines. So these maps cannot replace the building code. And so the building code must be used or a site-specific analysis must be performed, or that's not the right way to say it. Information that is obtained through testing at that site should always be determined and used in a building assessment. But our maps are for definitely helpful for regional assessments. They would be very applicable for trying to understand linear infrastructure or bridges or anything that is more than a site, like a road, like a highway, underground pipelines. I cannot imagine how difficult that is to try to perform a whole regional assessment without access to these types of maps that have been generated now. However, for building of a particular thing, you would always do testing exactly at that site. Our maps are built from knowing the information at that site and having done that site analysis and then trying to regionally predict it elsewhere. So our maps are somewhere in between, in that I'd be surprised if somebody did testing in future and got a very different answer from what we had. Our maps are should be a very good indication of what it probably is, but we didn't have exactly the same data at that point, and we can be wrong in future. Or definitely the information at that site should be collected to know for sure.
Thanks, Sherry. I think we have time for one or two more questions before we move on. Brian, I think your question, Brian says, further to Don's question, could the mapping support retreat policies / no build policies? And I think the answer is potentially, and I think Tamsin's upcoming section will get into that a little bit more. And let me just jump over, there was one actual question in the Q&A. Now there's several, but the first one was, in the recent Taiwan earthquake, only a few buildings were damaged. Is that because of the building residents?
So this happens a lot in earthquakes, right? Either sometimes it goes really well, like the 2010 Male, Chile earthquake was a mega thrust earthquake, magnitude 8.8, but not the hugest effects in Santiago, because they have a very good building code, but they also have compliance with that building code. As opposed to in Turkey, Turkey has great seismologists and great engineers, but there was some failure there in terms of when things were actually built and checked whether they adhered to the building code. However, we're always surprised. There's always stronger shaking than we would have predicted, or bigger rupture than we would have predicted. That is always possible. But in Taiwan and Japan and Chile, they have earthquakes much more frequently than we do. Their building stock is tested much more frequently than ours. And that's one of the major reasons for little damage from the recent event in Taiwan.
Thanks, Sherry. Maybe just one more, Tamsin, before we move on. Does the seismic site amplification include topographic amplification?
The short answer is no.
Okay. Okay, I think we should move on to the next section, Tamsin, and then hopefully we can still reserve some time and space for more Q&A.
That sounds great. Jessica, there, Sherry, just for you to mull over it for your answer, should someone who sees their planning district showing up as light green and low on some of these hazards still be concerned about earthquakes? I will leave that with you. And now we're going to move to why should planners care about seismic hazard? Just quickly, some of the limitations of the maps, and I think Sherry's covered all of these actually. The maps do not depict risk. Risk, we'll talk about in length in the next few slides, but that's where you're looking at consequences. The maps are providing susceptibility and hazard threat or intensity, if you will. They don't replace the need for site-specific investigation, and they don't fully capture human-made alterations to ground conditions. So we know there's lots of buildings in the Fraser River Delta, and there is likely to have been lots of ground improvements before those went in. Sherry, anything else to add here before I move on?
Maybe to clarify about that, our maps are meant to be for natural ground conditions or before anything was built. And so, for example, dikes or roadways, we remove the fill in our calculation. But if something has been built, it probably has been built according to the information at that location. So even though our maps look very scary for liquefaction hazard potential in the Fraser River Delta, anything that's been built has tried to densify the ground. And so there has been engineering, even of the ground, that we haven't captured in our maps.
Thanks, Sherry. Okay, and just before I continue, I do want to say that we really welcome and want to understand how planners see the use of the maps and potential barriers to the maps. We don't have all the answers. So I'll just say that as caveat, and if we have time, we'll get your input. So just thinking about hazards and nexus with land use, these fun cartoons are from a guidance document on incorporating hazards in land use. So of course we have our regional growth strategies, our official community plans, and both of those often includes hazard maps, areas, policies, development permit areas. Down here on the left, we'll go left to right. So one of the first steps is really defining the susceptibility and hazard threat. So that is what these maps do for those seismic hazards: shaking, amplification, liquefaction, and landslides. Then we need to identify who and what could be harmed. So I recognize these comics are not for seismic, they're for flooding, but then we're looking at what are the buildings, the critical infrastructure, the service disruptions that could be in these areas of high hazard threat. And then thinking about what's the severity of the consequences. So that's when insurers and municipalities use damage curves to understand what could happen to this building in this location, given our understanding of the hazard threat. And then we want to develop strategies, policies, regulations to reduce the consequences to an acceptable level. And that's when you hear the talk of risk tolerance criteria, or our tolerance of risk. Okay, so the use of these maps in risk and vulnerability assessment, and I think I saw a question on that. So the maps are providing that spatial information on susceptibility and hazard threat. So they tell us where the hazard threat is likely to be more intense due to those site conditions and basin effects and under that specific seismic condition, so that return period. Then we need to combine that information with parcel level building information and damage and loss curves to start to understand what we could anticipate in terms of casualties, debris, recovery time, damage to buildings, etc. We can set risk reduction goals that define success in terms of how the buildings will perform after an earthquake. We can then look at our policy options and consider our realistic interventions and how those interventions will improve our risk management and improve the performance of the buildings. And of course, there's multiple considerations whenever we think about interventions, thinking about the other objectives for housing, affordability, occupant displacement, as well as are there multiple hazards in a certain location, and what are you already doing for flood hazard or landslide hazard? So some of the hazard related planning tools we have, as we discussed, our regional growth strategies and official community plans and the hazard mapping and policies there. We do have in the Local Government Act the ability to create development permit areas for hazards, and we see those for steep creeks, steep slopes, wildfires, flooding. And then we've got our subdivision approval, so making sure it's safe for the use intended, zoning and rezoning opportunities in terms of density, which of course increases risk, as well as the type of building and what you can ask for in terms of the assessment, the site-specific investigation, and then building permits. And of course, through that, there's the opportunity to ask for more study by qualified professionals. So just looking at some of these, we've got those bigger overarching policy documents. And in those, we really have the opportunity to avoid new risks and reduce existing risks. So we can reduce exposure by not putting things in harm's way. So in some of those more intense hazard areas. And we can reduce the vulnerability by retrofitting our buildings and infrastructure, or looking at how to best build buildings that will perform well after an earthquake. And we can think about avoiding those high hazard areas for critical infrastructure and higher risk activities where there's more person hours in the location. Development permit areas, we have those for, as I said, lots of different hazard applications. We have been reaching out to the provincial government to understand if seismic hazard could be included in the list of hazards that you could have a development permit area for. And so far, we don't have an answer, but we'll continue looking into that. Subdivision approval and zoning. So back to my bungling earlier of the short buildings, long buildings. Are there long buildings? Tall buildings. And their susceptibility to damage from the different site periods. Continuing on the different potential planning tools. So we know technologies like base isolation and supplemental energy dissipation, things that I can only read on a screen and don't understand, but I do understand that those are most cost effective when they're considered at the earliest point in the design process. So it's an opportunity to be understanding where this is definitely a good idea, and working with the clients to understand what could be done to make this building a good performing building after an earthquake. In terms of reference for site-specific investigations, so we have an opportunity to ask for certain things in those site-specific investigations. And I think something Sherry mentioned, if we have a site-specific investigation coming back with very different results than what you're understanding from the maps, that could be an opportunity to have a peer review.
Right.
We can use our RFP requirements to ensure that these maps are considered. In terms of linear infrastructure, alternative alignments, or thinking through prescriptive design requirements in some of these areas in terms of the most resilient infrastructure to shaking, liquefaction, and landslides. And now, how do these work with the building code? So these seismic microzonation maps are the best information for local site conditions. And they're above and beyond the building code. The 2020 and 2024 BC building code focus on collapse prevention. So this is to allow escape if a building is damaged. So it's life safety. It's not to be considered earthquake proof by any means. So there is the opportunity to consider performance-based design, where we're looking at how the building, or aiming at a building that's performing well post-earthquake. So why these are better information is that the National Building Code, which the Provincial Building Code relies on, has those local site effects grouped or binned. Of course, as they can't possibly look into every inch of the country. And so again, the maps could be used to communicate with the client that the code may not be as good as a performance-based design in these locations. And I'm going to ask Sherry to weigh in here if she has any comments.
This is a challenging thing to try to explain, that our maps do not replace the code, but our maps are above and beyond the code in terms of the latest current understanding of the local conditions, and how they will interact with and propagate the seismic energy that's moving up through that soil during an earthquake. But our maps are somewhere in between a site-specific analysis and the national scale mapping. That's why they're regional maps. They're somewhere in between. It is considering a site-specific analysis that we have calculated what the ground motion or what the liquefaction or landslide displacements will be at that location, given what we know about that subsurface condition. But we only knew that in every location that we had geodata. And we had to correlate or predict in between. So that's why you would still need to do a site-specific analysis for any structure that you're going to build in future. But that the National Building Code, which is done in a very simplified code procedure, doesn't deal with what will happen to earthquake ground shaking as it propagates through the material properties at the site. It's just a grouped, simplified answer. It says that VS30 is 400 meters per second. So in general, around the world, we generally see this average amplitude of shaking for a 400 meter per second site. And that's the simple answer or the median answer coming out of the building code. But we have said, okay, it's 400 meters per second, but there's some soft stuff at the top and it's nonlinear response. Our analysis is much more sophisticated. It is a site-specific, sophisticated level of analysis at particular locations that's then regionally mapped or predicted.
That's
I should
perfect.
work
That's
on trying to
perfect.
explain this more in future, but that's the best I can do at this time.
I think, that's understandable. So because there was a lot of field testing and a lot of sophisticated analysis that just can't possibly be done nationally, this is better information, but that the code is still the legal code.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to keep going in the interest of time. Other uses in engineering standards, we can incorporate our assets and their condition and look at the mapping to understand where failures may most likely occur or where we want to invest in newer technologies of pipes, for example, that are more resilient to liquefaction. It can also help us improve planning for emergency response. We can understand where we might have a lot of debris that needs to be moved, where the hot spots are in terms of where we might see interruption of critical infrastructure, concentration of casualties, as well as can help us think through where we might need to prioritize rapid building assessment following an earthquake. Okay, we did have some questions for you. I think I'm going to ask them very quickly with Slido. So again, we're going to Slido at slido.com and you put in that number. How do you best see these maps being used in planning? Or if you're an engineer, an emergency manager, or otherwise, just please put that. So we just want a word or two. How do you see these maps being used? Great. We're getting lots of answers. So informing risk assessments. I think that's great. Development permit areas I've seen come up a lot. More information from the start, integration into HRBAs, so another risk assessment, development permits. Informing OCPs I've seen come up a bit, and zoning maps, infrastructure planning, asset management. Fantastic. That's really helpful to have the input. And I'd certainly welcome continuing this conversation with planners about how best to use them to scare people so I can afford housing. All right. Site-specific development planning.
I did see the one answer, not sure, which
Yeah.
what I was fearing, in that I can only imagine what it's like on the other end. There's 30 maps. Which one do I use? What the heck are these? We've made 30 maps because they're all useful in different ways. I certainly don't think regional planners will use every map. I want regional planners to know that there's 2 different return periods and they should contrast and compare those for the different types of hazards. The susceptibility maps are often a perfect input for your own local risk assessment. Like, we have taken those maps to anticipate what the seismic hazard is, but those are often the inputs for a seismic hazard or risk analysis that your own community might do in future. So you have those as inputs now.
Yeah, absolutely. And in GIS form, so easy to overlay your building information. Yes, I like this last one, made available to developers and real estate agents. I'm gonna skip forward. I think we'll skip over barriers. That will be for another discussion because I want to leave a bit of time for more questions, because I believe, Jessica, you're getting a few more.
Yeah, thanks. If we can skip all the way back to Joe Balderson's question. I don't know if you know this offhand, Sherry. He's asking, what does Woodward Reach in Richmond represent on the maps? I'm not sure.
I think it's just a GIS label that comes with the labels that we're using. Sometimes they label communities and sometimes, you know, the names of streets. Literally, it's just whatever the label was in the GIS layer.
Okay, thanks, Sherry. Similar, and I don't think we can, and we don't have like the fulsome answer to this, but it's a really good question. Similar to questions above, is there any decision-making tool or support associated with this project, given that urban development and critical infrastructure are already located in some high hazard locations? This can feel like a wicked problem, especially for local governments with little capacity and expertise in risk assessment.
Can I jump in, Sherry, for a second? And then I think as a planner working in this area, this is not just a seismic hazard question. I think we haven't had the tools perhaps to incorporate hazards well in land use planning. The same questions come up with flooding. You know, how do we set a risk tolerance criteria? What about if it's only a renovation versus a full subdivision? And you do see different approaches to decision-making tools for natural hazards, from sort of setting very specific criteria on when you would allow different types of development, to development permit areas, to a whole range of policy interventions. So to say that, you know, I do bring this to the province often as something that is missing and needed. And in the meantime, I think as planners, we need to think through with our colleagues how to best do this. Sherry.
I was reading another question.
Sorry. We can go to another question.
I think you answered it. I think we can jump to Dawn's question. For the basic seismic hazard inputs, Have you used NRCan or your own study? Was there any impact of Georgia Basin effects on seismic shaking, whether PGA or spectral? And I think I commented already that basin effects are integrated, but Sherry, did you want to comment?
This was the question I was reading.
Yeah.
So our maps include the Georgia Basin as well as site response or site amplification. They are different from the building code. The building code uses VS30. And what we see is that we anticipate higher intensities or higher amplification at, I hope I get this right, at short periods for stiff sites. And the MVC ground motions are conservative or higher than what we anticipate at long periods for deep sites. We are not spending a lot of time trying to justify why these are different. What we are trying to communicate is the building code only knows about VS30, and the amplification that's driven from the building code is only based on VS30. But our mapping goes above and beyond VS30. It understands the whole soil column as well as the fact that you're in a basin. And so they shouldn't be the same, actually. That's what the maps are going that next step past the building code, including local effects to seismic shaking.
I'm going to remind Sherry quickly about my question, Jessica jumping in. Should people worry if they're in the light green? They still need to worry?
Right. For amplification, if the amplification or de-amplification is 1, then we anticipate that the shaking won't be greater than or less than. It's just, it should be the shaking level for that intensity or dense soil condition. So it looks like there's no shaking intensity, but there is. It's just the map isn't saying that it's more than or less than.
Right, it's a relative to the base condition.
Right.
Thanks, Sherry.
Yeah.
So you're still going to shake?
Yes, that's right.
Yes. Thank you. Okay, sorry, Jessica, back to you.
That's okay. I'm not sure, Dawn, if your next question was answered in Sherry's most recent response. He's saying, Jessica noted Georgia Basin effects included. Oh, maybe answered well. Okay, he's asking about BS 760. Okay, so I think we answered Dawn's question, and I think that's it for questions. There's just a nice comment from Annie, a really nice closing comment from Annie. Yeah, as we're moving to close here. Hopefully we can use, and stay tuned, we do have a for more information slide, which is really important. Annie saying, hopefully we can use these maps to critically target local, regional, provincial, and federal spending to maximize our collective resilience during or after seismic events. I think that's a really nice comment. I agree. I think it's back over to you, Tamsin.
Thanks, Jessica. Okay, just 2 more slides left here, maybe 3 if we have time. Take home messages. So seismic hazard involves a variety of hazards that impact buildings and infrastructure in different and compounding ways. These maps are developed through extensive field study and sophisticated methods, so they're the best information available in the region. Thinking about those regional systems and land use, these maps can be really helpful to think for us to build, as that last comment said, a more resilient region. Planners have included flood hazard across policy frameworks. How do we best incorporate seismic hazard? I think we had some good suggestions on that very brief Slido, and hope to continue the conversation. These maps can help us take risk-based approaches to land use planning and development, and also help us identify where retrofits are most needed. And of course, that will depend on the building information. And we can always also ensure that we're thinking about the economy of scale as we retrofit our buildings for energy efficiency and climate risk and other objectives. What can we do to increase our seismic resilience? Sherry or Jessica, what else would you like everyone to remember as they leave the webinar today?
I think it is this concept that the maps are a seismic hazard map, knowing as much about the region in terms of how the ground is going to respond to earthquake shaking. And so that's an update or newer or supersedes the building code in that way. And at a regional scale, that is very difficult to grapple with. Engineers will always do a site analysis, but how does a city deal with or plan for seismic without a regional map? So here it is. It's available now. It will our seismic hazard understanding doesn't really change every 5 to 10 years. I expect these maps can be used for definitely a decade or two in terms of the ground conditions. In terms of the seismic hazard, the input that we considered was based on the 2020 building code. So it can be reproduced every time there's a new understanding of the input motions.
Thank you, Sherry. Jessica, any quick words?
We still have the slide on we still have one more slide, right? On where to actually get the information. Okay, just want to make sure people were seeing that because we did have questions popping up about where to access things. Yeah, I think as I always say about this project, when I was working on the City of Vancouver earthquake strategy, I'm sorry, I can start my video there. Sherry was working at the time on the basin effects themselves, and then the seismic microzonation mapping for Ottawa was hitting the front page of the paper. And I was like, well, we really need to integrate this best available information really into strategy and policy and all these things. So 10 years later, we have this hazard information. We have it beautifully mapped thanks to Sherry and her team. It's a lot of work, and I hope we can put this awesome work to use in all of the planning applications that Tamsin was discussing and outlining. So we have a lot of good work to do over the next 5-10 years to really put this information to good use. I just wanted to make a quick comment as well. In addition to the for more information slide, the stuff on here, there also is an Understanding Risk BC video on this topic as well about the microzonation mapping. And Tamsin, I think you were a part of that session as well. So we can share that link too. It just provides a little bit more context and around things like how we might use this to create guidelines around tall buildings. Again, there was comments around, you know, how we're targeting density with the BC government push on density and how we might integrate this into where we're putting towers and how we develop those towers and stuff over the coming years is going to be really important. Thanks.
Thanks, Jessica, and thanks, Sherry. And yeah, as a planner working in this area, I would really welcome thoughtful exchange on how to best incorporate this information and other hazard information to make the region more resilient in our land use and development planning. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. We have one last question for you. Did you learn something new today? We do really hope so. I hope our approach to layman's and technical depth was appreciated. And I think really just saying thank you. Sherry, did you want to just say a last few words as project lead?
Overall, it's amazing how interested everyone is. And we know the maps aren't perfect, but we truly have worked hard to make a resource that's available for regional planning. That's why we wanted to bring it to this audience. I have no idea how you were dealing with seismic hazard before now. I hope we've contributed to making it a little easier to do your job in future, even though I know it can be a challenge to deal with. But there are resources going to be available soon for you.
Annie, I see you've raised your hand. Please unmute. You have 1 minute left.
Has the BC government funded further mapping of this type? Like, I see people saying, you know, I hope this is going to happen in Squamish or on the island. And I'm just wondering, you know, what's the scope of the contract? Is it almost up or? Is it going to continue with the BC government to provide more of this type of mapping for our province? Fingers crossed.
Yeah, it's one of two things. I mean, they have continued to move eastward in Metro Vancouver, so we're doing more of the area than we thought when we started. So we're trying, but at the same time, there has been this effort for EGBC to develop guidelines to do seismic microzonation in future, so that other communities understand all the nuances or inputs that are necessary. So it's one of two things. Presumably, the province will be thinking of that and has already contributed funds to keep going. But at the same time, there is guidelines on how to do it yourself in future. Any community could do a level 1 or level 2 with a little bit of money, a little bit of thought, a little bit of effort. Maybe you need the province money to get to a level 3 for a whole region, sure. But it's not undoable for communities or governments to try to 2 steps on their own.
Thanks, Sherry. And on that note, important to keep all the geo data you get from different site investigations for different projects. Okay, I'm going to say thank you again. We've really appreciated your attention this morning, afternoon, and please be in touch.